She carried his heir. She wore his crown. She smiled through every lie he fed her across 5 years of marriage, and he still chose another woman's bed. Tonight, Queen Luna Seraphine Vale didn't come to the Moon Crown banquet to celebrate. She came to burn it down. If you've ever loved someone who treated your loyalty like a weakness, stay until the end. This one's for every soul who swallowed their pain in silence and finally decided they were done. Drop your city in the comments. Let us know where in this world you're watching a queen stop begging and start walking. The Great Hall of Draven Palace had never looked more alive, and Seraphine had never felt more like a ghost inside it. 800 candles burned in the iron chandeliers overhead, throwing amber light across the vaulted stone ceiling and painting every lord and lady below in warm gold. The long banquet tables sagged under silver platters, roasted boar, honeyed duck, 3 kinds of bread still steaming from the kitchen fires. Musicians in the gallery above played something bright and celebratory, a northern reel that had been fashionable at court for 2 seasons, the kind of tune that made even the older nobles tap their boots against the floor without meaning to. The wine flowing from cut crystal decanters was the kingdom's finest reserve, a dark red that smelled of crushed blackberries and cold mountain air, and it had been flowing since the 7th bell. This was the Moon Crown Banquet, the oldest feast in the kingdom's ceremonial calendar, held once every generation to honor the coming of an heir to the royal bloodline. Tonight, it celebrated something the court had waited 5 long years for. The child growing inside Queen Luna Seraphine Vale, 9 weeks along, confirmed by the palace physician just 3 days prior. The announcement had sent the court into a frenzy of joy. Lords had ridden hard from distant territories. Ladies had commissioned new gowns in silver and white, the traditional colors of Luna celebration. The palace kitchens had not rested in 48 hours. Every soul in that hall believed tonight was the beginning of something. They were right. They just had the wrong story. Seraphine stood at her place beside the high throne, dressed in silver silk that caught the candlelight like a second skin. Her dark hair was pinned with the Vale moon crest, 3 small crescents in white gold that her mother had worn before her. She held a goblet she had not touched. Her back was straight, her chin was level, and her face wore the composed expression that had taken her 4 years to perfect. The look that said nothing is wrong even when everything was, the look she had worn through the banquet celebrating the 3rd anniversary of her marriage, through the autumn council session when she had sat 3 feet from Ronan and felt the distance between them measured in something worse than miles. Through every morning she had woken in this palace and reminded herself that a Luna does not flinch in public. She had been wearing that face for so long it had stopped feeling like a mask and started feeling like scar tissue. Ronan stood beside her. King Alpha Ronan Draven, 34 years old, 6 feet and 2 inches of military breeding and inherited power, dressed in the black and gold ceremonial coat of the Draven line. His jaw was clean-shaven for the occasion. His dark eyes moved across the room with the easy confidence of a man who had never once questioned whether the room loved him, because in his experience it always did. He lifted his goblet and the hall responded with a roar of approval, and he smiled. That particular smile, the one that looked like generosity but was really just comfort. The smile of a man who had never needed to work hard for anything's affection. Seraphine watched that smile from 2 feet away and felt nothing. That was new. For a long time, even in the worst of it, she had still felt something when she looked at him. Anger, mostly. Sometimes grief. Once, toward the end of last winter, something so close to hatred that it had frightened her, and she had gone to the stables at midnight and stood with the horses until it passed. But tonight there was nothing. Just the particular clarity that comes when you have made a decision and fully committed to it, when the part of you that doubts has finally gone quiet. She had made her decision 11 days ago, sitting in the private library at the top of the East Tower, reading the letters by firelight with hands that barely shook. She had read them twice. Then she had sat very still for a long time, watching the fire burn down to coals. Then she had folded them carefully and placed them back in the leather satchel where she had found them, inside the false bottom of the locked cedar chest that Ronan kept in his war room. A chest she had never been meant to open. A lock she had only learned to pick because she had spent 5 years in this palace collecting small skills the way other women collected jewelry, because instinct had told her from the beginning that she would need them. 11 days. She had carried that knowledge through physicians' appointments and council dinners, and one very long afternoon tea with the Countess of Edenmore, who had talked for 2 hours about her daughter's upcoming betrothal, while Seraphine had smiled and refilled her cup and thought, I know what my husband is. I know exactly what he is, and tonight everyone else will too. She had not been idle in those 11 days. The letters were in the inner lining of her gown, flat against her ribs, all 14 of them, each one in Ronan's hand, each one signed with the private seal he used for correspondence he never intended to be seen. She had made copies, which were currently in the possession of 3 separate parties outside the palace walls. She had also gathered the other documents over the preceding months, piece by piece, because even before she found the letters she had known something was wrong, had felt it the way an animal feels a shift in weather before the clouds appear. She had been building this for longer than she had admitted to herself. The feast progressed. Courses came and went. Lords gave toasts praising the coming heir. Ladies raised their goblets to the Luna's health with expressions of genuine warmth, and Seraphine received each toast with a nod and a smile and the composed face that had become her armor, her longest-running performance. Ronan gave a short speech that the hall received with thunderous approval, and she stood beside him while he spoke and watched the way his eyes moved to the far end of the hall twice in the space of 4 minutes, quick and involuntary. The way a man's eyes move toward something he is trying not to look at. She did not follow his gaze. She already knew where it went. Lady Celine Arden sat at the lower noble tables, which was a concession to appearances. She had been seated there rather than near the high table at Seraphine's quiet instruction 3 days prior, a small act of preparation that had required only a word to the head steward and had gone unquestioned. Celine was 31, a widow of 6 years, daughter of an old border house whose military debts had been mysteriously cleared 18 months ago. She was beautiful in the way a weapon is beautiful, deliberately, with intention. Tonight she wore deep green, and the candlelight loved her the way candlelight loves people who already know they are being watched. Seraphine had known about Celine Arden for 14 months. She had not known the full scope of it until the letters. The feast moved toward its final hour. The musicians shifted to slower music, the kind that serves as a signal that the formal proceedings are winding down, that lords may begin making their farewells and the court can exhale. Servants moved through the hall collecting empty platters. Conversations grew louder and more relaxed as the wine did its work on 800 people who had spent the past 3 hours being ceremoniously correct. Seraphine set down her goblet. She turned to the chamberlain standing to her left, a thin man named Aldrich, who had served the palace for 20 years and who had, 3 days ago, been handed a sealed instruction along with a sum of coin that represented his absolute loyalty for one specific evening. She looked at him and gave the smallest nod. Aldrich moved to the bell stand at the edge of the dais and struck it 3 times. The hall quieted by degrees, the conversations tapering off as people registered the formal signal, faces turning toward the high throne with the expectant attention of a crowd prepared to receive a final royal word before the evening closed. Ronan looked at her with mild surprise. She had not told him she intended to speak. There was no reason she should have. A Luna Queen addressing the court at a celebration of her own heir was not unusual. He did not look concerned. He looked briefly proud, the reflexive pride of a man watching his wife perform a function, the same way he looked when she handled a difficult council wife or navigated a complex diplomatic introduction. He did not know yet. She had made sure he would not know until the moment arrived, because Ronan Draven was a man who prepared, who managed, who controlled, and the only way to strip that from him was to remove his capacity to prepare entirely. She took one breath, the last breath, she thought, that Queen Luna Seraphine Vale would ever take while pretending. Then she spoke. "Lords and ladies of the kingdom," she said, and her voice carried without effort across the stilled hall, clear and steady and carrying exactly the weight she intended. "I am grateful for your presence tonight and for the joy you have brought to this celebration. I am grateful for every toast given in honor of this child." A murmur of warmth moved through the crowd. "I want to give you something in return," she said. "I want to give you the truth." The warmth shifted. Not to alarm yet, just attention, a slight sharpening, the instinctive response of a court trained to hear subtext in formal language. She reached into the inner lining of her gown. The rustle of silk was the only sound in the hall. She drew out the first letter and held it so the candlelight fell across it, so anyone near the dais could see the broken seal, the dark red wax of the Draven signet, the folded edges worn soft with rereading. She did not open it yet. She simply held it and let every eye in the hall confirm what they were seeing. Ronan went very still. She had not looked at him until now. She looked at him now. 5 years ago, she said, still addressing the hall, still holding that steady tone that had cost her 4 years to build and was now, finally, being used for exactly the purpose it had been built for. I came to this palace as a Vale daughter, as a Luna bondmate, and as a wife. I came in good faith. I came believing that the vows sworn under the silver moon carried the same weight for the man who made them as they carried for me. Seraphine. Ronan's voice was low, controlled, the voice he used when managing situations, the voice that said this ends here. This is not the time. You told me that for 5 years, she said, and there it was, the first break in the composed face, not grief, not anger, something sharper and colder than either, something that lived on the other side of both. Every time I brought my concerns before you, that it was not the time, that I was wrong, that my instincts were the problem and not your behavior. She paused. I have decided the time is now. She unfolded the first letter. She began to read. She had chosen this particular letter first because it was the earliest in the sequence, dated 11 months into their marriage, and because its content was not yet the worst of it. It was a letter of longing. That was the word Ronan had used, written in his own careful hand. Longing. He had written to Celine Arden about the weight of a marriage he had not chosen freely, about the political nature of their bond, about how he had never wanted to take a mate from the old noble bloodlines, but that the council had required it. He had written that Celine was the only woman he had ever chosen for himself. He had written that he intended to change that. He had written, in very specific terms, what he intended to change it to. By the time Seraphine reached the third paragraph, the hall was utterly silent. Not the polite silence of formal proceedings, the silence of people who have stopped breathing. That is a private correspondence, Ronan said, and his voice had changed. The management tone was fraying at the edges, something hotter underneath it. And you have taken it without consent, and you will stop this now. I found 17 letters, she said, setting the first down on the edge of the throne table and picking up the second, between the second year of our marriage and last month. You would like me to stop. I would like you to have been truthful with me for the past 5 years. Neither of us gets what we would like. She read from the second. At the lower tables, she was aware peripherally of Lady Celine Arden sitting absolutely motionless, her hands flat on the table in front of her, her face gone the color of old bone. She had been beautiful walking into this hall tonight. She looked less beautiful now, in the specific way that beauty collapses when the ground beneath it shifts. She read from the third, which was the one that mattered most, the one from 14 months ago, in which Ronan had not written about longing or private feeling, but about something concrete and specific. In this letter he described, in the careful language of a man who understood contracts, how he intended to restructure the Luna succession law through a council vote he had been quietly preparing, how he had identified 2 council members who could be moved, how a Luna queen who failed to produce an heir within 5 years of bonding could be formally released from royal bond under an obscure provision in the Border Territory Accords, and how once that provision was invoked, the position of Queen Luna would become vacant, and Celine Arden would be made queen before the next winter. He had written this 14 months ago. 9 weeks ago, Seraphine had become pregnant. The hall erupted. Not in the clean way that crowds erupt at spectacle. This was the ragged, chaotic surge of 800 people processing something simultaneously, voices breaking over each other, lords rising from their seats, ladies gripping their neighbors' arms. 3 of the senior council members at the high side tables had gone ashen. Lord Caspar Marin, who had sat on the council for 16 years, and who was one of the 2 names quietly implied in the letter's restructuring plan, had pushed back from the table and was very carefully not looking at anyone. Silence. Ronan's voice cut through the noise with the full force of Alpha Command, and it worked. It always worked. That bone-deep compulsion built into the register of a ruling Alpha's voice, and the hall staggered toward quiet the way a crowd hit by a strong wind staggers, involuntarily, by reflex. He turned to Seraphine. And for the first time that evening, she saw it. The control breaking, the real thing underneath, the part of Ronan Draven that did not manage but reacted. His jaw was tight. There was something in his eyes she had not seen before, something close to fear. Not fear of her, not exactly, but the particular fear of a powerful person who has just realized a situation has escaped them entirely. "You do not know," he said, his voice deliberately lower now, dropping the command register, trying to bring this back to something that could be managed between two people rather than performed for 800. "What you're talking about? Those letters are taken out of context. You don't understand the political circumstances that required—" "I understand perfectly," she said. "This child is my heir." He stepped closer. "You are carrying the future of this kingdom, and you are standing in front of every lord and alpha in this territory having a breakdown." "No." Her voice did not rise. "I am standing in front of every lord and alpha in this territory having a reckoning. There is a difference." She reached into the inner lining of her gown again and removed a second bundle. Smaller, a tied fold of documents rather than letters. She set them on the throne table beside the letters without unfolding them. The financial records documenting the clearance of House Arden's border debts from the Royal Discretionary Account are there. The record of the council vote manipulation meetings, noted by your private steward in his chamber log, is also there. I have copies with 3 separate parties outside these walls. If anything prevents those copies from remaining intact, they go to every ruling alpha in the outer territories within a fortnight. The hall was very quiet again. Ronan stared at the documents on the table. Something moved through his expression. Not guilt, she thought, not guilt exactly, but the complicated grief of a man watching a structure he had built over years collapse in a single evening, watching every angle and contingency he had prepared fall useless in the face of something he had not prepared for because he had not believed it was possible. He had not believed she was capable of this. That was, she thought, his greatest mistake of all. Greater than the affair. Greater than the letters. The affair and the letters had been personal failures, failures of character, failures of fidelity and honor. But his certainty that she would never do exactly what she was doing now, that had been an error of judgment, a fundamental misread of who she was, and it had been entirely his doing. He had created the conditions that built her into someone capable of this. He had done that. She had simply paid attention. "You want to talk about this child," she said, quieter now, and the room stayed still enough that every word carried cleanly to the back tables. "You want to talk about what the heir to this kingdom means. Let me tell you what it means to me. It means this child will not be raised in a palace where his mother's worth is measured by her usefulness and discarded. The moment a more convenient option emerges, it means this child will not watch his mother pretend she does not see what she sees, pretend she does not know what she knows, and call that pretending strength. That is not the kingdom I will deliver him into." She heard something shift behind her in the crowd. It was not words. It was a sound, low and collective. The sound a room makes when it has shifted allegiance. Ronan heard it too. She watched him hear it. "Seraphine." His voice, for the first time tonight, carried something unguarded. "Don't." She looked at him for a long moment. She had loved him once. That was true. And she would not pretend it wasn't, even now. She had come to this palace at 23 as a veiled daughter, with her mother's moon crest in her hair, and more trust than caution. And she had loved him in the way young women love men who are powerful and certain, and seem to know exactly where they are going. That love had not lasted past the 2nd year, but she had stayed because she had believed in the bond, believed in the structure, believed that a Luna Queen had obligations that did not end simply because the man she had bonded with had turned out to be something other than she had hoped. She had stayed because she was not the kind of person who left. She was still not that person, but she understood now that leaving was not the same as abandoning. She reached up. She unpinned the veil moon crest from her hair, the 3 white gold crescents, her mother's piece, and held it for a moment in her palm. It was lighter than it looked. It was always lighter than it looked. She set it down on the throne table, beside the letters, beside the documents. She removed the royal crest brooch from her shoulder next, the Draven signet in silver, given to her on her bonding day, the mark that said she belonged to this throne and this king. She placed it on the table. The hall made that sound again. She looked at Ronan one last time. "I am not committing treason," she said. I am refusing to be held to vows that were never mutually honored. The kingdom can determine for itself what that means." She turned from the high throne. She walked, not quickly. That was important. She had known that before she ever came to this hall tonight, had rehearsed this in her mind 100 times in the 11 days since the letters. A woman who runs looks frightened. A woman who walks slowly looks like she made a decision. Seraphine walked with her back straight and her chin level and her hands at her sides. Through the absolute silence of 800 people who had been told since birth that a thing like this did not happen, that a Luna Queen did not remove her crest and leave her king standing in front of the assembled court, that such a thing was outside the possible. She walked the length of the great hall. No one stopped her. She was not sure anyone in that hall could have moved quickly enough to stop her, even if they had wanted to. Such was the quality of the silence, that particular frozen disbelief that holds a crowd in place more effectively than any command. She reached the great doors. The guards, by some mercy or some shock, stepped aside. She pushed through into the corridor beyond, and the cold air of the palace's stone halls hit her face, and she kept walking. Behind her, through the heavy doors, she heard the hall break open. She heard Ronan's voice, full command register now, no longer trying to manage, no longer trying to reason. She heard him call her name twice, heard the crash of something, a goblet or a chair, heard the eruption of voices all speaking at once, lords and ladies and council members, the whole structure of the court cracking apart under the weight of what had just been placed on it. She did not stop. She had a cloak waiting in the east antechamber, left there 3 hours before the feast began by a palace maid named Aura, who had been with her since the Veil House, and who was, at this moment, with Seraphine's traveling chest in the stable yard. She had a horse. She had the copies distributed to 3 locations outside the walls. She had 11 days of preparation and 4 years of learning, and a clarity of purpose she had not felt in longer than she could remember. She rounded the corridor toward the east wing, her silver gown catching the torchlight, the sounds of the hall growing more muffled with each turn. She reached the east antechamber, pushed open the door. The cloak was there, dark wool folded over the back of a chair, and she crossed to it and swung it over her shoulders. And in the brief pause of fastening the clasp, she allowed herself one moment, just one, just a breath, to feel the full weight of what she had done. It was very heavy. She had expected that. It was also, underneath the weight, something she could not name immediately, something she had not felt in so long she had almost forgotten it existed. She reached for the word and found it. Relief. She had been waiting for 11 days to feel that, and it was there, solid and real, and she held it briefly before setting it aside because there was no time for relief yet. Relief was for later. Relief was for when she was out of the palace walls and north of the Draven River crossing and past the point where Ronan's reach could catch her before she was ready. She moved through the antechamber and out the side passage to the stable yard. Aura was there, holding the reins of a gray mare. Seraphine had been quietly riding for 3 months. Nothing flashy, nothing the stable records would flag as unusual, just a solid-footed northern horse with good endurance and a temperament that didn't spook easily. Aura's face was pale but steady. She handed over the reins without a word, and Seraphine took them and swung up into the saddle. And for a moment they looked at each other in the dark courtyard with the sounds of the palace fracturing behind them. "The East Gate?" Aura asked. "The East Gate," Seraphine confirmed. She had arranged for the East Gate guard rotation to be shifted that evening. Nothing suspicious, just a scheduling change that had gone through the steward's ordinary administrative function, the kind of small, unremarkable change that happens constantly in a palace of this size. The guard on duty was not one of Ronan's men. He was one of the old palace regulars who had been there before Ronan's appointments, who remembered the Vale family with warmth, who had accepted an unremarkable night shift reassignment without asking questions. The East Gate opened when she reached it. She rode through. The night air outside the palace walls was cold and smelled of wood smoke from the lower city, and the sky above was clear and dark, the stars close and sharp the way they got in late autumn, when the air lost its summer thickness. Below her on the road the city spread out. Lights in windows, a few night market stalls still burning, the distant bark of a dog somewhere in the merchant quarter. She did not look back at the palace. That was a rule she had made herself. Once she rode through the East Gate, she would not look back. Not because she was afraid of what she would feel if she did, but because she had spent 5 years looking back, looking over her shoulder, revisiting and second-guessing, and she had decided that was over. She set her face north and rode. She was perhaps a quarter-mile down the northern road, the palace behind her and the city lights beginning to thin on either side, when she became aware that she was being followed. Not closely. The sound was still a distance back, hoofbeats too irregular for a patrol, too fast for a citizen's evening ride. Someone had come through the east gate behind her. Someone who had moved quickly from the hall to the stables to mount up, which meant someone who had anticipated this, or at least anticipated something, someone who had stayed loose and ready rather than frozen in the moment of shock that had held the rest of the court in place. She had planned for this possibility. She had 3 alternate routes north and a contact at the Crossroads Inn 4 miles up who would provide fresh direction regardless of which road she took. She increased her pace, the gray mare responding without complaint, moving from canter toward a longer ground-eating stride that ate up road in the dark. The hoofbeats behind her increased. She leaned forward over the mare's neck and let her run. Behind her, somewhere in the dark between the palace walls and the first mile of northern road, she heard a second set of hoofbeats join the first, then a third. They were sending riders. Of course they were. She had known they would, had known from the moment she planned this that Ronan would not stand in that hall frozen for long, that the alpha in him would recover faster than the husband, that within minutes he would be moving, mobilizing, doing what he had always done when confronted with a problem, pursuing it, controlling it, containing it by force of will and force of riders if necessary. She had planned for 3 riders. The sound behind her suggested more than 3. She did not slow down. She leaned lower over the mare's neck and let the cold night air cut past her face and focused on the road ahead, on the darkness between the trees where the northern road entered the first stretch of forest, on the Crossroads Inn 4 miles distant, where there was help and a choice of directions and a man who had been paid to have a fast horse ready and no questions. 4 miles. She had 4 miles of open road with riders behind her closing the distance, and inside her, quiet and steady as bedrock, was the child she was carrying and the decision she had made and the 11 days of preparation she was betting everything on. The forest line approached. She hit it at full gallop and was swallowed by the dark. Behind her, the riders came on, and none of them, not Ronan on his war horse, not the 3 guards he had sent ahead, not the council members scrambling to understand what they had just witnessed, not Lady Celine Arden sitting white and motionless in the great hall with Seraphine's documents on the table before the court. None of them knew yet where she was going. None of them knew about the northern wolf territories. None of them knew the name Kael Veros. And not one of them could have imagined, in the worst of their fears about this night, what was waiting for Queen Luna Seraphine Vale at the end of that dark road north, or what she was about to become. The forest swallowed sound differently than open ground did. On the road, her pursuers had been noise, hoofbeats and shouted commands, and the distant clank of armor catching together in the cold air. In the trees, those sounds broke apart, bounced off bark and stone, came at her from wrong angles so that she could not tell precisely how many riders were behind her, or how close. The darkness between the pines was total in the way only deep forest darkness is, the kind that has weight to it, that presses against the eyes and makes the brain work harder to assemble shapes from nothing. The gray mare ran without needing to be pushed. That was one of the things Seraphine had noted when she had spent 3 months quietly choosing this horse. She responded to pressure the way good horses do, by leaning into it rather than breaking against it. Seraphine kept low over her neck and let her pick her own footing on the uneven road, trusting the mare's night vision over her own. She was not afraid. That was the thing she kept coming back to as the trees blurred past on either side and the cold air cut into her lungs. She had expected fear, had prepared for it, had thought through what she would do when her body tried to override the plan with panic. But what she felt instead was the particular narrowing of focus that comes when all the variables have been removed and only the immediate moment remains. Left at the split oak. Crossed the shallow stream at the second ford, not the first. The inn is the third light past the crossroads stone. She had walked this road in her mind 100 times in 11 days. She walked it now in the dark with riders behind her, and the child steady inside her, and the moon coming and going behind the clouds overhead. The split oak appeared on her left. She took the fork without slowing. The riders behind her did not take it as quickly. She heard the confusion in the sound of them, the pause, the voices, the moment of wrong choice that cost them 40 seconds. 40 seconds was not salvation, But it was distance, and distance was what she needed. She crossed the first ford without stopping. The water was black and cold, and the mare plunged through without hesitation, throwing up spray that soaked Seraphine's boots and the lower edge of her cloak. She did not slow for the second ford either, felt the mare find the crossing by instinct, heard the water behind her as the riders reached the first ford, and the confusion of voices got louder and then quieter as the trees took them again. The third light passed the crossroads stone. She saw the crossroads stone, pale granite, catching what little moonlight filtered through the cloud cover, and counted lights. There and there and there. A yellow glow between trees that meant firelight and a window, and the man she had paid to have a horse ready, and no questions. She came off the road into the inn yard at a controlled trot, unwilling to arrive at a gallop and announce herself to anyone inside who had not been briefed. The yard was mud and straw, and the smell of hay and manure, and there were 2 horses in the paddock that were not hers, which meant the inn had other guests tonight, which was a complication she had accounted for but not enjoyed. The side door opened before she dismounted. A man came out, stocky, middle-aged, wearing an apron over rough clothes, moving with the deliberate unhaste of someone who had been told to look like nothing unusual was happening, regardless of what was happening. His name was Peter. He had been a Vale House contact for 12 years, the kind of man whose usefulness lay entirely in his capacity to be unremarkable. "North Horse is ready," he said, not looking directly at her. 3 riders came through an hour ago asking about a woman traveling alone. I told them I'd seen no one. How long ago? An hour. Long enough they're past the Miller's Junction by now. He paused. There's a 4th rider who came through after them. Alone. Didn't ask about anyone, just bought a drink and sat near the window facing the road. Seraphine dismounted. Her legs were steady. Description: big, border country gear. Didn't look like a palace man. She thought about that for 2 seconds. A palace man would have asked about her. A palace man would have been in a hurry. Someone who bought a drink and sat near the window facing the road was either waiting for something or watching for something, and neither of those meant palace. "The North Horse," she said. Petter led her around the side of the inn to a smaller paddock where a dark bay was tied and saddled, heavier built than her gray mare, with the deep chest and short back of a mountain-bred horse. She ran a hand along his neck, and he turned to look at her with one dark eye and did not move away, which was what she needed to know. "Road north forks at the burned village," Peter said quietly, untying the lead. "Left fork goes to the Draven garrison outpost. Right fork goes into the border territories. Past the second ridge, you're outside Draven jurisdiction." "I know. Beyond the second ridge, you're in Varos land." He said it the way people said the name in the lower territories. Not with fear exactly, but with the particular weight of something that has earned its reputation. They don't welcome visitors who arrive without arrangement. "I have arrangement," she said. He handed her the reins and looked at her for the first time directly, and there was something in his face she recognized. Not pity, something closer to the expression people wear when they are watching someone do something they believe is probably correct and definitely dangerous. "The gray mare," she said. "Turn her out in the back pasture. She's earned rest." She mounted the bay and rode north. She did not reach the border ridge that night. She had not expected to. The border ridge was a full day's ride in good conditions, longer in the dark, and she was not reckless enough to push a horse she had just mounted through unfamiliar mountain approaches at night. What she needed was a place to stop before dawn that was far enough from the main road to be worth stopping at, and she found it 4 miles past the inn. A forestry shelter cut into the hillside, small and roofless on one side, but with enough wall to break the wind, enough dry wood stacked inside to make a fire that would not be visible from the road. She made the fire small and fed the bay from the grain bag tied to the saddle, and sat with her back against the stone wall and let herself be still for the first time since she had struck the hall bell 3 hours ago. The child was fine. She knew that with the particular certainty of a body that was paying attention. 9 weeks was too early to feel much, but she was aware of it the way you are aware of a sound at the edge of hearing. Not loudly, but constantly, a presence that registered even when she was not directly thinking about it. She thought about Ronan, not with tenderness. She was past tenderness, had been past it for most of a year. But she thought about him the way you think about a weather system, with practical attention, trying to calculate what he would do, how fast he would move, which of his instincts would drive him first. The rage would have come quickly after she rode through the east gate. Ronan in rage was a force of controlled demolition. He did not lose himself in it. He used it, directed it with the same efficiency he applied to military campaigns. He would have riders on the main northern road within the hour. He would have sent a separate contingent to the Vale House territories in case she was heading home. He would have secured the palace, locked down the document situation as best he could, given that she had already distributed copies, begun the work of managing the court's reaction with whatever story he decided best served him. He was good at that. She had to give him that. He was very good at converting catastrophe into narrative, but he did not know about Kael Varos. She had been careful about that for 3 months. Careful the way you are careful when the thing you are protecting is the only remaining advantage you have. She had made no written communication, no message carried by anyone who had a second connection to the palace. The arrangement with Varos had been made through a single intermediary she trusted with her life and no one else knew. She fed the fire one more small piece of wood and closed her eyes and let herself sleep for 3 hours, which was all she permitted herself. She crossed the second ridge at midday. The border territory opened below her from the ridgeline in a way that took a moment to fully process. Not the cultivated geometry of the Draven lowlands, the neat-edged fields and planned village spacing of territory that had been organized and managed for generations. This was older land. The valleys below the ridge were deep and heavily forested, the tree cover unbroken for miles except where rivers cut through, and the mountains to the north were the kind that have never been entirely mapped because the people who lived in them did not see the point of maps made by other people. She had been told it was hard country. She had not been told it was beautiful. She started down the far side of the ridge. She was an hour into the descent when she became aware she was not alone. It was not a sound. She heard nothing. It was the bay's ears, going sharp and forward in the particular way that meant something was present but not moving, watching rather than approaching. She let the horse slow to a walk and kept her hands loose on the reins and her eyes moving across the tree line on either side without fixing on any single point. "You've been in sight since the ridge," said a voice from the trees to her left. She did not startle. She had promised herself she would not startle. She stopped the bay and turned toward the voice. The man who stepped out from the tree line was not what she had imagined from the stories, and she had heard enough stories about Kael Varos to have assembled a reasonably detailed imagined version. She had expected something more deliberately imposing, the kind of man whose appearance was constructed around the reputation. What she got instead was a man who looked like he had been shaped by the land rather than posed in front of it. He was tall, dark-haired, dressed in border territory gear that had seen hard use. His face was angular and weathered, the face of someone who spent more time outside than in, with a scar along the jaw that had healed clean but not invisibly. He looked at her with eyes the color of deep water, and his expression held absolutely nothing that she could read. Behind him, half visible in the trees, she counted 4 others. "Alpha Varos," she said. "You're a long way from a palace," he said. It was not a greeting. "I'm aware." He studied her for a long moment. His gaze went to the cloak, to the horse, to her hands on the reins. "You rode through the night." "Most of it." Draven riders were at the northern garrison post this morning, asking questions. He paused. They weren't asking about a pregnant Luna Queen. They were asking about a fugitive who stole documents from the palace. That tells you something about how he's framing it. It tells me something about what I'm being asked to get involved in. He had not moved closer. Neither had his men. There was a quality to his stillness that she recognized from the best soldiers she had ever watched. Not the stillness of patience, but the stillness of a body that could stop being still very quickly. "You sent word 3 weeks ago through Marais. Said you might need the north." "I said I would need it." "You said might." I was being polite. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but the ghost of one, gone before it fully arrived. "You cost him in front of every Alpha Lord in the territory." "I cost him what he should have been paying all along." He looked at her steadily. "You understand what you're asking of this territory. Draven has a long reach and longer memory." "I understand," she said, "exactly what I'm asking. I'm asking you to protect 1 woman and 1 child in exchange for the evidence I'm carrying that connects Celine Arden and 3 corrupt council members to the plot that cost your territory the Northern Border Agreement 6 years ago." The stillness sharpened. She had counted on that. Had counted on the fact that a man who had been deliberately betrayed would sit with that betrayal, the way a coal sits in a fire, banked and patient and still burning long after the original flame had moved on. She had read everything she could find about the border war. She had read the treaty records and the council minutes and the personal account of the negotiator who had brokered the agreement only to watch it collapse within a month of signing. She had found the thread that connected that collapse back to the council members named in Ronan's letters. She had been carrying that thread for 6 weeks, waiting for this moment to place it in the right hands. "You have proof of that," Varos said. "Not a question." "It's in a document pouch inside my cloak. You can verify it tonight." He said nothing for a long moment. The forest was quiet around them. That particular northern quiet that has birds in it and wind and the sound of water somewhere below. But no human noise, none of the constant ambient sound of settled territory. "If the documents are what you say," he said finally, "you and the child have my protection. And if they're not, then you ride back south and take your chances with Draven riders." He said it without hostility, just flat fact, the way a man states terms who is accustomed to terms being kept. "They're what I say," she said. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he stepped back and turned toward the trees, and 2 of his men moved to flank her horse in the loose, professional way of men who were escorting rather than capturing, and Varos began walking north into the forest without looking back. "Keep up," he said. "We don't slow for palace horses." The bay moved forward without being asked, and Seraphine followed the Alpha Varos north into territory that had no Draven law in it, and no Draven reach, and no version of the story that put her in the wrong. She was almost certain she was safe. She was entirely wrong about what was waiting for her inside Varos's stronghold, because in the great hall of the northern fortress, seated at the fire with a cup of Varos border wine and the easy posture of a man who had been expected, was a messenger she recognized, a council rider in stripped-down traveling clothes, the Draven seal removed from his jacket, but the jacket cut in a style she knew as clearly as her own name. Someone had reached Varos before her. Someone who had known exactly where she was going. The messenger did not look up when she entered. That was the first thing wrong. A council rider in foreign territory, seated uninvited at another Alpha's fire, should have looked up, should have tracked the door the moment it opened, should have had the particular alertness of a man in a position he knew was not entirely safe. Instead, he sat with his cup and his fire, and the easy posture of someone who had been told he did not need to worry about the woman coming through the door. Someone had told him that. Seraphine stopped 3 feet inside the hall and let the door close behind her and looked at the messenger and felt the bottom of the plan she had built over 11 days shift in a way she had no prepared response for. Varos came in behind her. He did not move to stand beside her. He moved to stand across from her, between her and the far door, and that positioning was not accidental, and she registered it with the part of her mind that had been paying attention to positioning and exits since she rode through the east gate, the part that had gotten very good at reading rooms. "Sit down," Varos said. It was not the voice he had used on the ridge. On the ridge, his voice had carried the flat neutrality of a man stating terms. This was something different. Not hostile, but settled. The voice of a man who had already made a decision and was now managing its implementation. She did not sit. "Who is he?" she said. Varos looked at her for a moment. "A man who arrived 6 hours before you did." "With what?" "With a counteroffer." He moved to the long table and picked up a document she recognized by its seal before she could read a word of it. The Draven royal seal, dark red wax, the same seal that had been on Ronan's letters. "Draven is prepared to cede the northern buffer territory to Varos, holding in exchange for your return to the palace." The buffer territory. 300 square miles of contested land that had been the source of the border war 6 years ago, that Varos had lost through a treaty manipulation she had documented and brought with her as leverage. Ronan was offering to return it, freely, without negotiation, without the years of legal process that recovering it through legitimate channels would have required. He had moved faster than she had given him credit for. She understood then what she was looking at. Not a man who had been panicking since she rode out the east gate, but a man who had been preparing. Not for her flight specifically, perhaps, but for the general possibility that something might go wrong, that a contingency might be needed. The buffer territory offer was not improvised. Improvised offers do not arrive with sealed documents 6 hours ahead of the person they are meant to intercept. Ronan had known she had a northern plan, not the specifics, not Varos's name, or he would have blocked the route before she reached the ridge. But he had known enough to prepare a northern contingency, which meant someone had told him something, which meant the leak was not in the 11 days of preparation since the letters, but earlier, much earlier, in the months before when she had been building this quietly and believed she was building it alone. She ran back through it. The intermediary who had contacted Varos, Maret, a trader woman who ran supply routes between the border territories and the southern markets. She had used Maret because Maret had no palace connection, no Draven contract, no reason to report to anyone in the capital. Maret had been her one clean line. Maret had a daughter who had married into a merchant family in the capital 3 years ago. She felt it land, not with the sharp shock of surprise, but with the dull, heavy recognition of a thing that makes sense too late. "The buffer territory," she said. Her voice was steady. She was not sure how. "That's what he offered you." "It's a significant offer," Varos said. He was watching her with those deep-water eyes, and she could not tell what was behind them. Regret, calculation, the particular discomfort of a man doing something he has decided is necessary, but not something he is proud of. "It's a bribe," she said. "It's 300 square miles of land that belongs to my people." He said it without heat. "Land that was taken through a manipulation I've spent 6 years trying to legally recover. He's offering to end that in a day. In exchange for handing over a pregnant woman and the evidence she's carrying. In exchange for returning a Luna Queen to her kingdom and her mate." He paused. That's how the document frames it. She looked at him. He met her eyes and did not look away, and she understood that he was not a villain in this. He was a man with a territory to protect, and a people who needed that land back, and Ronan had found the exact pressure point that would make the calculation work in his favor. That was what Ronan did. He found pressure points. He had been finding them his whole life. The messenger by the fire had still not looked up. "The evidence I'm carrying," she said carefully, "includes documentation of the council manipulation that cost you that territory in the first place. If you return me, that evidence goes with me, and Ronan buries it, and the people who engineered your loss face no consequences. The land comes back regardless." This time, she kept her voice level. "What about the next time someone in that council decides a border territory is a useful bargaining piece? What about the time after that? You get your 300 square miles and you lose every tool that would let you hold it against the next manipulation." She paused. "I am not offering you land. I am offering you the mechanism that keeps land from being taken." Something moved behind his eyes. She pressed it. "You told me on the ridge, if the documents are what I say, I have your protection. I showed you those documents an hour ago. You read them." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Were they what I said?" The silence in the hall had weight to it. The fire cracked. The messenger shifted in his chair. "They were," Varos said. "Then you already gave me your word." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the sealed document in his hand, and she watched him weigh it. The weight of land against the weight of word, and she could not tell which way it would fall, and that not knowing was the most frightening thing she had felt since she rode out of the palace, because she had built the entire northern plan on the assumption that Kael Varos was a man whose word meant something, and if she had been wrong about that, then she had been wrong about everything. "Leave us," Varos said. It took her a moment to realize he was speaking to the messenger. The man stood without a word and walked to the far door and went through it. And then it was just the two of them and the fire and the sealed document still in Varos's hand. He set it on the table. He did not open it. He did not hand it to her. He just set it down, and the gesture carried the particular finality of a thing being put aside. "You have 3 days," he said. "After 3 days, Draven will send more than a messenger, and what I can hold against a messenger I cannot hold indefinitely against a military column. 3 days to give me a reason this territory is better served by protecting you than by accepting his offer." It was not the full protection she had asked for. It was not the clean alliance she had planned. It was 3 days and a conditional, and the conditional was a harder bar than she had expected to clear. But it was not a door closing. It was a door held open by a single hinge, and she had built enough from less. 3 days, she said. He nodded once and walked out. She stood alone in the hall for a moment, the fire at her back and the sealed Draven document on the table in front of her, and she allowed herself to fully feel what she could not afford to show while he was in the room. The cold realization that she had been outmaneuvered on the first move, that Ronan had reached this territory before her not with force, but with precision, that the advantage she had counted on as her primary security had been reduced to a conditional and a deadline before she had even unpacked. The child shifted, or she imagined it did. 9 weeks was too early for that. She knew it was too early, but the sensation was real regardless of its source. A small, insistent pressure that said, "You do not have the luxury of shock. Recalibrate." She straightened her back and looked at the sealed document on the table and thought about Marais and the merchant daughter in the capital and the 6 months of careful planning that had been compromised at a level she could not have anticipated and would not waste time grieving. She thought about what she had. She thought about what she needed. She thought about what 3 days looked like when your only leverage was information and your only protection was a man who had just told you he was still weighing his options. Then she sat down at the table because sitting was practical and standing was theater, and she had used up her allocation of theater for the week, and she began to think. The stronghold was a working fortress rather than a residence, built for function the way border territory structures always were, with thick walls and narrow windows and rooms that served clear purposes rather than comfortable ones. Seraphine was given a chamber on the second level with a door that locked from the inside, a fire that had been lit before she arrived, and a basin of water that was cold by the time she reached it. She washed her face and hands and sat on the edge of the bed and went through the documents she had brought. Not to read them, she had read them enough times to recite them from memory, but to physically confirm they were still intact, still in the order she had organized them, still the complete set she had assembled over months. They were. She repacked them in the inner pouch and placed the pouch inside the traveling chest and locked it. Then she unlocked it again, removed one specific document, and locked it back. The document she held was a single page. A letter, not from Ronan to Celine this time, but a different kind of correspondence entirely. It was written in Celine Arden's hand, addressed to Lord Caspar Marin, and it was dated 4 months ago. It discussed, in careful language that was vague enough to be deniable in isolation, but specific enough to be damning in context, a meeting that had taken place between Celine's intermediary and a representative from the Harrington House, the same Harrington House that had been quietly positioned for the past 2 years to assume council leadership, if a change in the throne's occupancy were to occur. It was not the most explosive document she carried. The financial records and the border manipulation evidence were more immediately useful. But this letter connected something the other documents only implied. It connected Celine Arden not just to Ronan's private plans, but to an external faction that had been preparing for a throne transfer regardless of whether Ronan cooperated with it. Celine was not just a woman who had taken a married man. She was a woman who had understood exactly what position that gave her and had been systematically building a structure around it for years. She had let Ronan believe he was the architect of the plan to replace Seraphine because that belief kept him manageable and loyal and focused outward. But the Harrington connection suggested that Celine's actual plan extended past Ronan in ways he had not been told. Seraphine had not fully understood this until she read the letter for the 3rd time, the night before the banquet. She understood it completely now. She folded the letter and held it and thought about Varos and the 3 days he had given her, and she thought about what kind of man he was based on what she had seen in the past 6 hours. A man who had weighed the buffer territory offer seriously enough to accept a messenger and read a sealed document, but who had still given her the room in the 3 days rather than simply holding her for transfer. A man who had made a conditional rather than a refusal. He was not certain. That was the thing she had to work with. He was not certain, and uncertainty in a man like Varos was not weakness. It was intelligence. The intelligence of someone who had been burned by certainty before and now held every major decision at arm's length until the full shape of it was visible. She needed to show him the full shape. She needed to show him that what she was carrying was not just evidence of Ronan's personal failures, but evidence of a structural threat to every independent territory in the kingdom. A threat that did not go away if Ronan got her back and buried the documents, because the Harrington faction did not need Ronan to proceed. It had been building parallel to him. If Ronan fell, they had a path. If Ronan succeeded in taking her back and stabilizing the court, they had a different path. The only thing that closed both paths was the letter in her hand and the 3 other documents that cross-referenced it, all made public, all placed in front of the Alpha Assembly where they could not be quietly suppressed. She needed Varos to understand that protecting her was not an act of charity or an act of defiance against Draven. It was self-preservation. She got up and went to find him. Ma'asam. She found him in the upper room that served as his working space. Maps on the table, two men she did not know standing on the far side looking at the northern ridge lines, a fire burning low in the corner. He looked up when she came through the door, and his expression did not change. But something in the quality of his attention shifted in a way she had come to read as focus. She crossed to the table without being invited and placed the letter on the map in front of him. He looked at it without touching it. Celine Arden's hand, she said, addressed to Lord Caspar Marin, 4 months ago. She tapped the relevant section. That name there, Harrington. Read what follows it. He read it. He read it twice, which told her he was not a man who reached conclusions quickly, which was both reassuring and maddening given the timeline she was working with. He looked up. The Harrington house has border territory claims, she said, 3 of them, all currently disputed. If they take council leadership, those disputes get resolved internally by people they own, in their favor. She watched him process that. That's not a Southern court problem. That's a Northern territory problem. That's a Varos problem. His eyes went back to the letter. Ronan doesn't know about this, she said. He thinks Celine is his. He thinks the plan is his. He is the only person in this entire situation who has been played harder than me, and unlike me, he doesn't know it yet. She paused. If you return me to him with this evidence, he buries it because he still believes Celine is an ally, and the Harrington faction continues building with zero interference. If I reach the Alpha Assembly with this letter, the entire structure collapses in public where it cannot be reconstructed. Varsa's hands were flat on the table. He was looking at the letter. You came here with leverage, he said slowly. You led with the border manipulation documents because you knew that was my wound. But this is the real thing you're carrying. I led with what would get me through your gate, she said. This is what keeps both our territories standing in 5 years. The 2 men across the table had gone still. Varos looked up at her, and for the first time since she had met him on the ridge, his expression was fully readable. Not the controlled neutrality he had been showing her, but something genuine. The expression of a man who has just had his calculation overturned and is deciding whether to be angry about it or pragmatic. He chose pragmatic. She had counted on that. The assembly convenes in 12 days, he said, in the neutral hall at Caro's Crossing. I know. Getting you there means moving you through territory that Draven riders are already entering from the south. I know that too. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the moment the last of the weighing finished. Saw it in the way his shoulders settled, some small-held tension releasing, the physical signature of a decision made. You understand, he said, that if I commit this territory to moving you to Caro's Crossing, there is no version of this where I don't end up in direct confrontation with Draven. Yes. You're asking me to go to war. She met his eyes. I'm asking you to prevent one. The fire in the corner shifted and threw new light across the table and the letter and the map with its ridge lines and border markers. And in the silence that followed, she could hear the stronghold around them, the wind off the northern mountains, the distant sound of horses in the lower yard, the particular quality of a place that had been built to withstand things. Varos picked up the letter, folded it, held it. In the morning, he said, I want every document you have laid out on this table. Every piece. He looked at her steadily. If this territory commits to you, I need to know the full weight of what we're carrying. It was not a warm offer. It was not the clean alliance she had imagined when she had planned this 11 days ago in the East Tower by firelight. It was conditional and dangerous, and came with a man who would never fully trust her because trust was not how he had survived this long. But it was real, and real was what she needed. She reached into her cloak and removed the document pouch and set it on the table. I'll be here at dawn, she said. She turned and walked out, and in the corridor outside the door, she stopped and stood with her back against the cold stone wall and breathed, fully, slowly, the first full breath she had taken since she walked into the hall and saw the messenger by the fire. She was not safe. She was not close to safe. She had 3 days that had just extended to 12, a conditional alliance with a man who had almost sold her an hour ago. And somewhere south of the border ridge, Ronan Draven was reading the messenger's report and learning that his offer had not been accepted. That meant the next move would not be a document with a seal on it. That meant riders. That meant force. That meant Ronan in the full register of an alpha who had run out of patience for management and negotiation, who had decided the situation required something older and simpler than politics. And she had 12 days to reach the assembly at Caro's Crossing before that force arrived and made the choice for everyone. She pushed off the wall and walked back toward her chamber, and the cold in the stone corridor was absolute, and somewhere in the territory to the south, a king who had once loved her was deciding exactly how much damage he was willing to cause to bring her back. She already knew the answer. It was the same answer he had always given to every question she had ever watched him weigh. Whatever it costs. The riders came on the 7th day. Not 12. 7. Ronan had not waited for the messenger's full report to cycle back through the garrison network the way she had calculated he would. He had read the first partial account and moved, which meant he had already been moving men north before the messenger reached the stronghold, which meant the offer of the buffer territory had never been a genuine negotiation. It had been a delay, a way to buy time while the military column was already on the road. She had miscalculated the timeline by 5 days. She was standing in the upper room with Varos and 2 of his lieutenants when the scout came in, still breathing hard from the ride, frost on his jacket from the high ridge crossing. "Call 'em out of the northern garrison," the scout said. 40 riders, full kit, moving fast." Varos looked at the map on the table. He did not look at her. "How far?" he said. 6 hours. Maybe 5 if they pushed the last valley. 5 hours. Caro's Crossing was still 4 days north. The assembly was in 5. Every calculation she had built the past week collapsed into a single arithmetic problem with no clean answer, and she stood at that table and felt the particular cold of a plan coming apart not through failure, but through the one variable she had not been able to control: the speed of a man who had already decided the answer before she finished asking the question. "How many can you move?" she said to Varos. He looked at her then. "Against 40 Draven riders on open ground, not enough." "I'm not asking about open ground." He held her gaze. Something moved behind his eyes. Not the weighing she had watched him do for days, but something faster and more immediate. The calculation of a man who has spent his life making decisions in 5-second windows because the alternative was not making them at all. The pass at Greyveal narrows to 12 feet at the midpoint. 40 riders become 10 men wide becomes a different problem. Then we move through Greyveal. It adds half a day. We don't have 4 days to lose. We have half a day to spare. She looked at the map and traced the route with one finger without touching the paper, the way she had learned to look at things she could not afford to damage. The assembly at Caro's Crossing cannot be moved. The date is fixed by the Alpha Charter. If I reach that hall with these documents, Ronan cannot suppress what comes out of it. If I don't reach it, I know what it means if you don't reach it, Varos said, and his voice had the particular flatness of a man who does not need the scenario completed. He looked at his lieutenants. Something passed between them that did not require words. The shorthand of men who had fought together long enough that full sentences were an inefficiency they had stopped bothering with. "We ride in 2 hours, Varos said. Move the Luna to the east stable. Light pack. She rides with my forward 4. The lieutenants went. Seraphine looked at him across the table. "You could have taken the buffer territory offer," she said. Not an accusation. Just a fact she wanted acknowledged between them because she did not like the feeling of debts that went unnamed. "I could have been," he said. He began rolling the map. "That's not what I did." "Why?" He stopped rolling the map and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not calculation, not the careful, managed neutrality he had shown her since the ridge. Something older than that. Something that had been sitting underneath the management for a long time and was now, in the particular pressure of the next 5 hours, rising to the surface without his permission. "Because I've spent 6 years watching what happens when the people who are supposed to hold a line decide the cost is too high," he said. "And I am not that. Whatever else I am not that." He picked up the map and walked out. She stood alone in the room for exactly 10 seconds. Then she went to pack. The Greyveal Pass was everything Varos had promised in terms of tactical geography, and nothing he had mentioned in terms of physical reality. It was a cut through the northern ridge that the mountains seemed to have made reluctantly, narrow and steep, and wound with exposed rock faces on both sides that shed loose stone when the wind hit them wrong. The path through it was wide enough for 2 horses abreast at its most generous, and at the midpoint narrowed to a single file slot between walls of granite that rose 30 feet overhead and turned the sound of hoofbeats into something that lived in the chest rather than the ears. They hit the pass entrance at a hard trot with 3 hours of cold daylight left, and the scouts' report of draven riders somewhere behind them in the lower valley. Seraphine rode third in the forward column behind 2 of Varos's men, the bay moving steadily under her with the particular focus of a horse that understood the footing required something different than open road. Her hands were steady on the reins and her back ached from 4 days of hard riding, and the cold in the pass was a different quality of cold than the forest, direct and mineral, the cold of stone that is never fully warmed. She was not frightened of the pass. She was frightened of what was behind them, not Ronan specifically. She had stopped being frightened of Ronan as a person somewhere in the 11 days between finding the letters and walking into the banquet hall. What she was frightened of was the specific combination of a powerful man and a deadline, the way those 2 things together stripped away the careful management and left something raw and more dangerous. Ronan with time and options was a strategist. Ronan without them was something she did not have a clean name for and did not want to test at close range. The pass midpoint arrived, and the walls came in and the column went to single file, and the sound changed, and she watched the granite faces on either side and thought about the assembly at Caro's Crossing, and the letter in Celine Arden's hand, and the particular look on Lord Caspar Marin's face when she had named him in the banquet hall, the look of a man watching the ground open under him and calculating very fast how far the fall was. She thought about what she would say when she reached that assembly hall. She had been building the address in pieces for days, the way you build anything under pressure, not in a straight line but in fragments that accumulate until suddenly they are a structure. She knew the order of the documents. She knew which Alpha Lords would need the financial records first and which would respond more immediately to the territorial implications. She knew that Varos's presence beside her would carry weight that no document alone could produce. Because in the political language of Alpha assembly halls, a man who had put his territory on the line to get her there was making an argument his presence alone completed. The pass opened. The northern valley spread below them, wider than the southern approaches, the forest cover breaking in places to show the silver line of a river cutting through the lower ground. Somewhere ahead, 4 days of hard riding, was Caro's Crossing and the assembly hall and the fixed point she had been navigating toward since she rode out the east gate. Varos moved his horse up beside hers as the column spread back to 2 wide on the wider path. "Scouts back," he said without looking at her. She looked at him. "Draven column split at the valley floor," he said. 20 riders took the main northern road. 20 came for the pass. She processed that. "They knew we took Greyvile. They had their own scout on the east ridge." His voice carried no surprise. "Someone in the garrison knew this route was our likely choice." He paused. 20 riders in the pass behind us. 20 on the main road ahead. Whoever reaches Caro's Crossing first controls the approach. 20 on the main road. 4 days of riding on a route where Draven riders had the advantage of open ground, better supply lines, and the political authority to commandeer fresh horses from every garrison post between here and Caro's. She could not outrun that on the main road. Not with the horse she had, not at the pace she had already been pushing for 7 days. She looked at the valley below and did the arithmetic and did not like the answer. "There's a second route," Varos said. He said it in a way that meant he had been deciding whether to say it, and had decided, and was not entirely comfortable with the decision. "It cuts 2 days off the main road." "Through what?" "The lowland marshes. Eastern edge." He paused. "It's not a road. It's a route people who know it use. In this season, the ground is solid enough in the early morning when it's frozen. Past midday, it gets soft." Risks. Getting stuck. Getting lost. Running the horses into bog ground if the temperature rises faster than expected. He looked at her steadily. "And it takes us through Harrington-adjacent territory." She felt that land. Harrington-adjacent. The same Harrington name in Celine's letter. The faction that had been building parallel to Ronan's plans. The faction that did not need Ronan to succeed in order to proceed with their own version of the throne transition. If they had scouts watching the northern approaches, and if they were as prepared as the letter suggested they were, they would... Then moving through their territory with the evidence she was carrying would be moving through a space where the threat was not just Draven Riders with orders to return her. It was a different kind of threat, from people whose plans required the evidence she carried to never reach the assembly at all. 2 days saved. 2 days that meant the difference between reaching Caro's Crossing first and arriving to find it already controlled. She thought about this child. 9 weeks along, and she had been riding hard for 7 days. And the physician had told her in their last appointment that the first 3 months required care, required rest, required the kind of stable conditions she had not had a single day of since the banquet hall. She thought about the bay under her, solid and willing, but tired in the honest way working horses get tired, the effort showing in his movement now in ways it hadn't on the first day. She thought about Ronan's face across the throne table when the hall erupted around them, and the particular expression she had seen, not just rage, not just fear, but the look of a man watching something he had fundamentally misunderstood reveal its actual dimensions. He had not known she was capable of this. He had not believed it was possible. She was going to show him one more thing he had not believed was possible. "The marsh route," she said. Varos looked at her. "You understand what I just told you about the risks. I understand all of it. If the temperature rises and the ground goes soft, then we deal with soft ground." She met his eyes. "If we take the main road and the Draven column reaches Caro's Crossing first, there is no assembly. There is a hall full of Alpha Lords watching a king's military escort bring back his fugitive wife, and every document I carry gets framed as a stolen private correspondence before I open my mouth. The ground going soft I can survive. That I cannot." He held her gaze for a long moment. The cold air moved through the pass behind them, and somewhere in that cold air, 20 riders were moving north. "We camp at the ridge tonight," he said finally. "Start the marsh route before dawn when the ground is still hard." He looked ahead at the valley. "And you keep those documents on your body. Not in the chest, not in the saddlebag. On your body." "They haven't left my body since the banquet hall." Something crossed his expression, not quite the ghost of a smile she had seen on the ridge, but something adjacent to it, the look of a man recalibrating an estimate upward. He moved his horse forward and she followed, and the column descended into the northern valley with the sound of the pass closing behind them. They made the marsh edge by the second morning. The eastern marshland in late autumn was not the swamp of wet season, but something more ambiguous and therefore more treacherous. Ground that looked solid, that in the pre-dawn cold was solid, but carried beneath its frost-capped surface the memory of water, the deep moisture of terrain that never fully dried, that held the weight of a boot or a hoof with the particular reluctant tension of something that was tolerating you rather than supporting you. Varos rode point himself, which told her something about how he assessed the risk. He was not a man who sent others into situations he judged too dangerous to lead. She rode behind him with 2 of his men flanking and 2 at rear, and they moved through the marsh grass at a walk, no faster, with the particular concentrated silence of people who were listening to the ground. The cold held. They were 4 hours into the marsh crossing when the scout at rear came up fast. She heard him before she saw him, hoofbeats at a canter in terrain where everyone else was at a walk, the sound wrong enough to tighten every muscle in her back before he came into view. "Riders," he said, pulling up beside Varos. "Eastern edge, coming in from the Harrington Road, not Draven riders." Harrington. She had crossed into the outer edge of their territory an hour ago, and she had known it, and she had kept moving because stopping was not an option. But some part of her had hoped the marsh crossing was obscure enough that it would not be watched. Someone had been watching the marsh. Varos turned in his saddle and looked at her, and she saw the calculation running behind his eyes. The same calculation she was running herself, the one that said, 6 of us, unknown number of them, marsh ground that does not favor the kind of fast movement a confrontation would require. "How many?" Varos said to the scout. 8, maybe 10, more than them. And they were coming from the east, which cut off the clean continuation of the marsh route and forced a choice between turning north into deeper marsh or pushing east directly into whatever was coming toward them. Seraphine looked north. She looked east. She looked at Varos. "They're not here to negotiate," she said. "No," he said. "They're not. If they take the documents, they won't." His voice carried a flat certainty she had not heard from him before. The voice of a man who had moved past calculation into decision, the particular register that lived on the other side of weighing and was simply committed. It was a voice she recognized. She had used it herself, standing at a hall bell with 14 letters in her gown. She heard the Eastern riders now. The marsh grass was moving 30 yards out, the horses pushing through it at a pace that cared more about speed than caution, which meant they were not worried about the ground, which meant they knew this terrain, which meant she was the only person in this marsh who was operating without full information, and she needed to stop doing that immediately. "Tell me what's north," she said. "Solid ground, half a mile. It opens onto the approach road to Caro's Crossing." He looked at her. "If we reach it." Half a mile of marsh between her and the road to the assembly. Behind her, 20 Draven riders somewhere on the main road closing from the west. Coming at her from the east, 10 Harrington men who did not need Ronan's orders to know what they wanted from her and what they were willing to do to get it. And below her the bay, tired and steady, the best horse she had chosen for the best reason, asking nothing from her but direction. She looked at Veros, and for one single second she let herself see the full scope of what they were both standing inside. The cost of it, the weight of it, the specific kind of courage required. Not when you have everything to fight for, but when you have already given most of it away, and you are fighting for what remains with the knowledge that what remains is the only thing that ever mattered. The Eastern riders broke through the marsh grass into sight. 10 men, heavy gear. The Harrington crest on 2 of them, the others in the stripped-down dark clothing of hired work. The kind of men who showed up in the accounting records as contracted security and in practice were something with fewer constraints. The lead rider looked at Veros and then at her, and his hand went to his sword without drawing it. The gesture of a man establishing his intention before his mouth opened. "The woman comes with us," he said. "The rest of you walk away." Veros did not look at her. He looked at the lead rider with the deep-water eyes that carried nothing readable. "You're going to want to think harder about that," he said. The lead rider's hand closed on the sword grip, and behind them, from the western marsh edge, came the sound that Seraphine had been listening for and dreading in equal measure since the scout's report. Hoofbeats, multiple, fast, the particular rhythm of riders who had found their quarry and were coming in hard. The Draven column, 20 men. Coming from the west. 10 ahead of her, 20 behind her, half a mile of marsh between her and the road north. Varos turned in his saddle and looked at her, and his expression in that moment was the first fully open thing she had seen from him. Not managed, not calculated, just the raw face of a man who had committed to a thing and was now standing inside the full weight of that commitment with no exits and no regrets. "North," he said, and drew his sword. The bay ran. Not because she asked him, because she had leaned forward and the ground had opened north, and every instinct in that horse's body understood the only language that mattered in the next 60 seconds, which was not the language of commands, but the language of direction and will and the simple animal knowledge that stopping was the wrong answer. Behind her, the marsh erupted. She did not look back. She had made herself a rule about not looking back, and she kept it now, even with the sounds coming at her from 2 directions. Varos's voice cutting hard commands to his men, the clash of steel she heard at 30 yards and felt in her sternum, the Harrington lead rider shouting something that got cut short in a way that meant it had been answered with something other than words. She kept her eyes north and her body low and let the bay find his own footing through the frozen marsh grass, trusting the horse the way you trust the only solid thing available to you when everything else is moving wrong. The ground was holding cold enough still. The frost crust creaking under the bay's hooves, but not breaking, not yet, the deep wet underneath staying down where it belonged. 40 yards. The marsh grass was thinning. She could see where the ground changed color, darker, firmer, the approach of solid earth the way you see it from a distance. A different quality of stillness in the surface. She heard a rider behind her, closing fast. One horse, not a group, too close and too direct to be Draven riders crossing from the west. The angle was wrong. Harrington. One of the 10 had broken through whatever Varos's men had met them with and come north after her. She did not slow down. 20 yards to solid ground. The bay's breathing was loud and rhythmic and honest, the breathing of an animal giving everything available, and she felt the effort in him and did not ask for more because there was no more to ask for. and she felt something alongside that. Not tenderness exactly, something harder than tenderness. The particular bond that forms between a body and the thing that is carrying it through the worst moment. A bond that has nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with shared stakes. 10 yards. The rider behind her was close enough that she could hear his horse's hoofbeats separately from the bay's. A doubled rhythm, gaining. 5 yards. She hit solid ground and the bay's stride changed immediately. The cautious picking of marsh footing converted in a single step to the full extension of a horse on real ground, and she felt the acceleration the way you feel a door opening, sudden and clear and absolute. She asked for everything now. The bay gave it. The rider behind her hit solid ground 30 feet back. She had 30 feet and a horse who had been holding something in reserve, and she used every foot of it, pushing north on the approach road to Caro's Crossing with the cold air cutting her face and the documents against her ribs, and the child steady inside her and the assembly 4 days away. 3 days now. 2.5 if she did not stop. If the horse held. If the cold held. If nothing else broke between here and the hall where the Alpha Lords were gathering to conduct the business of the kingdom. She heard the rider behind her drop back. Not a tactical retreat. The sound changed the way a horse's sound changes when the effort becomes unsustainable. The rhythm going ragged, the hoofbeats losing their even spacing. He had pushed his horse harder than the marsh crossing warranted, and had nothing left for open ground. She did not stop until she had put a full mile between herself and the marsh edge. When she finally pulled the bay to a halt, she sat in the saddle and let him blow and looked back down the road, and saw nothing behind her but the empty northern approach and the distant line of marsh grass and the sky over it, going the gray-orange of late afternoon. Her hands were shaking. She had not noticed them shaking during the crossing, and she noticed now the tremor working up from her wrists to her elbows, the body presenting its bill for what she had borrowed against it. She breathed. She waited. 20 minutes later, 4 riders came up the road from the south. Varos was first. His left arm was held differently than his right. Not dramatically, not the way injuries look in stories, just the small compensatory adjustment of a body managing damage without advertising it. One of his men had a cut along his jaw that had bled into his collar and dried there. All 4 of them were present. All 4 horses were moving. She looked at Varos, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "The Harrington men," she said. "Not a problem anymore." She looked at his arm. "Not a problem either," he said in the same tone, and moved his horse north past her, and she turned the bay and followed. One. They reached Caro's Crossing in 2.5 days. She did not remember the last 12 hours of that ride with any clarity. She remembered fragments, a fire at a roadside post where Varos's name got them shelter and fresh water without questions, the particular quality of the sky over the northern approach to Caro's in the early morning, blue-gray and vast and indifferent in the way large skies are indifferent, the sound of the bay's breathing becoming something she monitored the way you monitor, a sound that tells you something important about the state of a thing you cannot afford to lose. She remembered Varos riding beside her through the last valley and not speaking, which was the version of him she had come to understand as the genuine one, not the managed silence of a man withholding, but the natural quiet of someone for whom words were tools rather than habits, used when they did work and set aside when they did not. She remembered thinking, somewhere in the gray hours before Caro's Crossing came into view, that she had spent 5 years in a palace learning to speak carefully and had come north to find a man who had spent his life learning when not to speak at all, and that the difference between those 2 educations said something she did not have language for yet, but could feel the shape of. Caro's Crossing was a border town built on the logic of the neutral ground it occupied. Squat stone buildings and wide streets designed for the movement of large groups, an inn that served every territory's riders without preference, and at its center the assembly hall, a long, low building of gray stone that had been standing for longer than anyone's grandfather could account for, and that carried in its walls the specific gravity of a place where things had been decided for generations. The Alpha Lords were arriving. She could see them as they came into the town, riders from 5 territories, each group in their own colors, the particular organized movement of men who carried authority the way soldiers carry weapons, visibly and with the understanding that everyone around them knows it is there. The assembly was not until the following morning. The lords were settling, meeting over evening meals, conducting the quiet preliminary negotiations that always preceded formal sessions in any governing body that had been doing this long enough to know that the formal session is where decisions are announced, not where they are made. Varos rode through the town without stopping to the assembly hall's side entrance and dismounted, and she dismounted beside him, and a stableman took the horses. And she stood for a moment on solid ground after 2.5 days of hard riding and felt the earth under her feet with a gratitude that was almost disorienting. "Tonight," Varos said, "I speak to Alden Moore and the 2 Eastern lords. You rest." She opened her mouth. "You rest," he said again, with the finality of a man who had watched her for 9 days and was now applying what he had learned. "You're no use to that assembly tomorrow if you walk in looking like what you've been through. You know that." She did know that. She closed her mouth. "The documents," she said. "Stay on your body all night." He looked at her steadily. "I'll have 2 men at your door, not for your comfort, for the fact that the Harrington faction has had 2.5 days to send word ahead, and I don't assume this town is clean." She nodded. He turned to go. "Varos." He stopped. She looked at him in the fading light of the Caro's Crossing afternoon. This man who had almost sold her and then had not, who had ridden into a marsh confrontation with 10 men and 20 riders closing and had drawn his sword and said north as if it were simple, who had an injury in his left arm he was not acknowledging and would probably not acknowledge until this was over, who had committed his territory to her cause for reasons she understood and reasons she suspected she would never fully understand, and who had not once, in 9 days, asked her for more than she was capable of giving. "Thank you," she said. It was inadequate. She knew it was inadequate. Some things are inadequate on purpose, not because you cannot find better words, but because the situation is too large for precision, and the only honest response is to offer something small and real rather than something elaborate and approximate. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, the same nod he had given when he committed his territory, and walked into the assembly hall. The morning arrived cold and clear. The assembly hall held 43 alpha lords and their senior advisors, and when Seraphine walked through the main doors with Varos on her left and the documents in an unlocked pouch at her side, the room's attention turned toward her with the unified weight of a collective that had been briefed on fragments and was now looking at the whole. She had thought about this moment for 11 days, had built it in pieces, had carried it through marsh crossings and past confrontations and the particular dark hours on the road when the only thing keeping the plan alive was the refusal to let it die. She had imagined it formal, structured, the kind of address she had spent 5 years in a palace preparing for. What she did instead was set the documents on the assembly table without preamble and say, in the raw American plainness she had learned was more credible than ceremony, "Read these, all of them, then we talk." And they read. It took an hour. The hall was not silent during that hour. There were questions passed between lords, sharp words exchanged across the table over specific documents. One prolonged argument in the far corner between 2 Eastern lords that she let run, because the argument itself was evidence that what they were reading was landing with the force she had needed it to land with. Varos stood beside her and said nothing, and his presence said everything a man's presence can say when he has put his territory behind something. Ronan arrived 2 hours into the session. She had known he was coming, had known since Caro's Crossing came into view that he would not let the assembly proceed without appearing in it himself, that whatever his riders had reported back to him, he would have calculated that his personal presence was necessary. He was right about that, as he was right about many tactical things. He walked into the assembly hall with 12 riders at his back and the full alpha command bearing of a man who intended to reclaim a situation by the force of his own credibility. He looked at her across the hall. She looked back. She had wondered, in the months since the letters, what this moment would feel like. The full confrontation, the direct line of sight across a room full of witnesses with nothing left unspoken between them. She had wondered if there would be something left of the old feeling, the thing that had been there at the beginning before it had been systematically removed by 5 years of lies applied in small enough doses that each individual one was deniable. There was nothing. She confirmed it quietly and set it aside. "You are standing in an assembly hall," Ronan said, his voice carrying the full formal register, the voice that commanded rooms. In possession of stolen documents, having abandoned your bond, your crown, and your responsibilities to this kingdom, I am here to take you home. Every lord in that hall was watching, all. These men, she said, and her voice was not loud, was not performed, was simply the voice of a woman who had made a decision 11 days ago and had not deviated from it through everything that followed, have spent the last hour reading documents that tell them what kind of kingdom you've been running. I'd invite you to address what's in them. Those documents are fraudulent. Lord Caspar Marin, she said, without looking away from Ronan, is in this room. I'd ask him whether the financial records on that table are fraudulent. She heard the hall shift. She heard Marin, somewhere to her left, fail to speak. Ronan's jaw tightened. You have no standing in this assembly. You surrendered your crown. I surrendered your crest, she said. My standing in this assembly comes from the child I'm carrying, who is the rightful heir to the Draven throne, and from the royal law that grants a Luna Queen full assembly access in any matter affecting the succession. She paused. I have read the law more carefully than you have. I had time while you were busy with other things. The hall was very still. Ronan crossed toward her. His riders moved with him, and Varos's men moved in response. And for a moment the hall had the specific tension of a physical confrontation that had not yet decided whether to become one. She watched it and did not move back. He stopped 6 feet from her. Up close she could see what the distance and the formal bearing had obscured. The tiredness in his face, the specific exhaustion of a man who had been moving hard for 9 days, managing a crisis that had refused to be managed. He looked like what he was, a man who had built his whole life on the certainty that he understood the nature of every piece on his board, and had discovered in a single evening at a banquet hall that one of those pieces had been building something entirely outside his awareness for months. He looked at her and she saw it. Not quite remorse, not quite grief, something that occupied the difficult space between those two things. The expression of a man standing at the edge of understanding what he had lost without yet being able to fully name it. Come home, he said, and for a moment it was just his voice, without the command register, without the formal bearing, just a man's voice in a room full of witnesses saying the only thing he had left. She looked at him for a long moment. No, she said, not with anger. There was no anger left, and she had carried enough to know the difference between when it was present and when it had burned through. Not because I can't forgive you. Maybe in time I can, but because what I would be coming home to is not a home. It is a structure that was designed around my compliance and will require my compliance to function. She held his gaze. I will not raise this child inside that structure. The hall had the particular quality of held breath. The law, said the eldest lord at the assembly table. Ren Moore, white-haired, 20 years on the council, a man whose word in assembly carried more weight than a formal vote, regarding a king who betrays the Luna bond during the carrying of an heir. He had a document open in front of him, not Seraphine's. The assembly charter is unambiguous. Ronan turned. The provision, Renmore said, in the measured voice of a man reading something he had already read twice to be certain, strips the right of sole rule from a king who violates the Luna bond before an heir is born, in cases where the violation is documented and witnessed. The documentation is before this assembly. The witness testimony, he looked around the hall at 43 lords who had spent the past hour reading, is this room. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Seraphine had ever heard. Ronan stood in it. She watched him stand in it, and this was the moment she had not planned for because it was not a moment that could be planned. It was simply what happened when a structure that had been built on false foundations was finally asked to bear full weight. It did not collapse dramatically. It settled. The way old buildings settle when the ground beneath them shifts, not with noise but with the slow visible change of something finding a new and permanent position. He looked at her one last time. She thought he might say something. He did not. He turned and walked out of the assembly hall, and his 12 riders followed him, and the doors closed behind them, and the hall breathed. The vote took 4 hours. The council stripped the sole rule provision. The assembly confirmed the Luna's succession rights as primary guardian of the heir. 3 council members, including Lord Caspar Marin, were referred to the territorial court on the financial manipulation charges. The Harrington House's border claims were frozen, pending investigation of the documents relating to Celine Arden's correspondence. Celine herself was not present. She did not need to be. The letter in her hand had spoken for her as clearly as any testimony. Varos was confirmed as Northern Territorial Ally under a revised border agreement that included the buffer land, not as a bribe, not as a transaction, but as a correction of a documented wrong, which was a different thing entirely, and everyone in that hall understood the difference. Seraphine sat through all 4 hours. Her back ached. Her hands had stopped shaking. The child was fine. She knew it with the same steady certainty she had carried for 9 days through everything that had tried to make her uncertain, the small constant presence that had been in the worst hours of the marsh and the pass and the dark road. The simplest possible answer to the question of why. When it was done, when the final record was signed and the lords began the gradual dispersal of a session that had finished its work, she sat alone at the table for a moment, not performing stillness, just being still, because she had earned it. Varos sat down across from her. They had not spoken much over 9 days. It struck her now that she knew this man better than she knew most people she had spent years in proximity to, because crisis compresses what comfort extends, and in 9 days of shared danger, she had seen more of who he was than 5 years of palace dinners had shown her of Ronan. "What happens now?" he said. It was not a political question. She heard that. "I go back to the capital," she said. "Not to the palace. To the Vale House in the lower city. I stay there until the child comes." She paused. "And then I do the work." "What work?" "The work of actually governing." She looked at the table. Ronan was not wrong about everything. He understood military strategy. He understood territorial negotiation. What he did not understand was that a kingdom is also the people who are frightened of their landlords and the families who cannot afford the winter grain tax and the border villages that have not had a functioning road in 6 years. She looked up. That is the work that did not get done while he was focused on consolidating power. "I know how to do it. I have been studying how to do it for 5 years with nothing else to spend the time on." Varos looked at her steadily. "You'll need northern cooperation on the supply routes." "I know." "That's a conversation." "I know that too." Something settled in his expression. Not the deep water opacity she had learned to read past, but something quieter and more open. The expression of a man who had made a decision some time ago and was only now finding the right moment to let it be visible. "The child will need a world worth inheriting," he said. "Yes," she said, "he will." She looked out the hall's narrow windows at the sky over Caro's Crossing. Gray and cold and enormous, the sky of the northern territories that did not make promises about weather or seasons or what came next. It simply was what it was, and you worked within it, and if you were paying attention, you learned to find the beauty in its honesty. She thought about Ronan walking out of the hall. She thought about what it cost a man like that to walk out instead of forward, the specific price of a pride that had finally outrun its own justifications. She did not pity him. She did not hate him. She held him in the particular neutral space that is what comes after both of those things have burned through, the space that is not forgiveness yet, but is the ground that forgiveness grows from, if you tend it, if you decide it is worth the effort. She decided it was worth the effort, not for him, for the child, who would one day want to understand his father, who would need her to have found a way to speak of him that was neither mythology nor condemnation, but simply the complicated truth of a man who had more gifts than wisdom and more power than restraint, and who had, in the end, lost everything he actually had by refusing to value it. That was a truth she could give her son. That was a truth worth carrying. She stood up. The documents were still on the table. She gathered them, all of them, every piece, and packed them into the pouch with the care she had given them since the East Tower, since the night she had sat by a dying fire and read them twice, and chosen to know what she knew. She would archive them properly, not destroy them. That would be wrong. That would be the kind of wrong that circles back. Archive them, so that what had happened was recorded, so that the people who came after would know what the kingdom had survived and how. Outside the hall, Caro's Crossing was going about its afternoon with the complete indifference of a place that has hosted history before and expects to host it again and finds neither remarkable. She walked out into it. The cold air was clean the way northern air is always clean, without apology, without comfort, without anything except its own honest temperature. She stood in it and let it hit her face and breathed it in. Behind her she heard Varos's step. She did not look back. She looked north, where the sky was the particular shade of gray that comes before it clears, where somewhere past the ridgelines the northern territories were wide and cold and ungoverned in the ways that mattered, where a man had drawn a sword in a marsh and said north as if direction were the simplest thing in the world. It was, she thought, the simplest thing in the world. You decided where you were going. You kept going there. You let the things that fell away fall away, and you held on to the things that held, and you arrived somewhere, and you looked at what you had built from the pieces of what had broken, and you found not the life you had expected, but the one you had actually earned. A Luna who survives betrayal does not return for revenge. She had said it herself, in the banquet hall, in the silence that had followed her setting down the crest. She had said it knowing it was true, the way you sometimes know a thing is true, before you have fully lived your way into the understanding of it. She lived into it now. She returned to rewrite destiny. And the cold northern sky above Caro's Crossing did not care about destinies or crowns or the complicated wreckage of a marriage that had lasted 5 years and ended in 14 letters and one woman's decision to stop pretending the cost was acceptable. It was just sky, enormous and cold and going on forever. She walked into it.